They're confusing, mysterious, and often misunderstood. We're talking all about histograms today. Before we start, to all you new subscribers, thank you. I'm super excited about the community we're building here, and I'm looking forward to hanging out with you. And if you haven't subscribed already, we do simple to understand photography and video tutorials, insights, and reviews. So hit that subscribe button, you won't be sorry. Okay, so what exactly is a histogram? Let's start there. In the simplest terms, a histogram is just a graph that shows the frequency of something occurring. So if we look at this, so the forest has a whole bunch of trees, right? So if we were to count up all the trees and determine what their heights were, say that we have 5 trees that are 10 feet tall, we have 25 trees that are 20 feet tall, we have 30 trees that are 30 feet tall, and we have 10 trees that are 40 feet tall. So plotting that on a histogram, it might look like this. In a photograph, there are a few different types of histograms. All colors have a luminosity value or perceived brightness value attached to them. So if you were to just turn a photo into a grayscale and remove the actual color tones, you'd only see the light and dark values of each pixel. So a luminance histogram shows the brightness of the pixel in your image. An RGB histogram shows the different histograms for each of the primary colors in your photo. And a color or combined RGB histogram, that'll show you the additional colors like yellow, cyan, or magenta created by the combination of your RGB primaries. But today we're going to focus on the luminance or luminosity histogram, which shows you the perceived brightness of the pixels on your image, with the darkest pixels all the way to the left of the histogram and the brightest pixels all the way to the right. See, every color has an inherent brightness value to your eyes, so on a grayscale, pure blue would look like a dark gray, pure red would look like a middle gray, and pure green would look like a light gray. Looking at the histogram, pure blue would be over here to the left, reds would lie here about a third of the way on the chart, and greens would be here about 2/3 of the way into the chart. Okay, so a few questions I sometimes get asked are, why do we even need histograms if we have a screen right on our camera showing us the photo as we take it? Well, the LCD screen on the back of the camera is not really reliable. I mean, it depends on the brightness of the screen versus the brightness of the environment. Also, these are just JPEG depictions and they're not raw images, so the dynamic range is actually lower as you're looking at it on the camera. And so why is this even important? Well, if you underexpose your image, then there's a danger of having no information for the darkest part of the image. And if you're overexposed, then there's a danger of having no information for the brightest part of the image. And if you were to print this, then those parts of the image simply wouldn't print properly. You would get spots that are just the color of the paper underneath. I mean, this can be fixed in post, obviously, but you'd rather have that information and get it right in camera. All that said, there's no right histograms, there's no perfect depiction. It all depends on the scene you're catching. Okay, here we are. We've got our landscape scene all dialed in. I've got my camera on a tripod, and you know that I'm using Aperture Priority. If you saw my video last week, it's a great way to bridge the gap between auto and manual mode and still retain all of the most important decisions for yourself to ensure that you're getting the right exposure for your image. So if you haven't seen that, I'll put a link in the description below and you can check that out. It's really a great way to make the move from auto mode to manual mode and still retain those most important decisions and use the intelligence of the camera in order to get a great exposure. And you can see here that I'm an f11, and that will allow me to get enough depth of field to get the entire scene in focus. The camera's decided that it needs a 2.5 second exposure in order to get it exposed properly. And the first thing I do is I turn off the steady shot when I'm on a tripod, because you don't want the camera to be searching for movement, and those little gyroscopes will actually produce some movement in your camera, and that camera shake will actually make your image a little bit soft. So I learned that the hard way when I first started, so I always turn that off. Remember to turn that off if you're on a tripod and it's not too windy or you're not in the river and you know that it's super stable, you want that off. The second thing I do is I check my white balance, and I have it set here at 6100. And what you're trying to do here is just look at the scene and make sure that it's dialed as close as you could possibly get it on the back of your camera. And that will help you a lot in post, so you're not trying to figure out what the white balance was. If you can get that as close as possible, that's good. I've got my ISO set to 100. I'm focused in on the edge of the bridge, and that ensures that I'm going to get the entire scene in focus from front to back on an f11 aperture. And so the last thing to do is check the histogram and be sure that the exposure is what I want for this scene. The scene is not super contrasty, so the only real highlights I'm worried about are down there on the water. And the rest of the scene is pretty dark here. But we'll use our compensation dial to move that exposure up a bit, and we'll watch the histogram to be sure that we don't blow anything out. So I'll move it up 1/3 of a stop, 2/3 of a stop, and a full stop. And you can see now that that histogram has a spike there on the right. And that is a warning sign, as well as the zebras, which are showing me that I have a possible blowout up there on the left where the sky is. And so I'll dial this back 1, 2, until I see that histogram doesn't have any spikes anymore. Now remember that this is a JPEG rendering, so it's difficult to tell on the back of the camera. If I didn't have those zebras, I wouldn't know at all that that was blown out. And my histogram gives me the ultimate guide that I know that I'm exposed to the left here a little bit because of that sky, which I hadn't noticed right away when I was looking at the scene, because I'm sitting here under some trees and I hadn't seen that that sky might be blown out. So this really helped me in this situation. So now I just take my exposure, and I like to use a remote control in order to ensure that I don't shake the camera when I hit that shutter button. So we take our exposure, and the first thing we do is we check to see if it's blown out, and it looks like it's okay. I don't have any blinkies, and my exposure looks on the histogram to be okay. And you can see that that blue is pushed all the way to the left because the blue parts of all of these pixels that it's capturing are pretty dark. So that's why that's pushed to the left there. So next thing I do is I check my focus, and to ensure that I got everything in focus and front to back. And it looks like everything looks good all the way through. And so the last thing I would do is I would probably want to see if I can expose this a little bit more to the right. So I would take another exposure, and just to see if that would be a better exposure, since this is pretty far exposed to the left. So I will dial this back up a little bit more to 0.7. And the zebras are hitting the bridge now, and they're still hitting the sky. But you could see the histogram still doesn't show a blowout. So we'll try that and see what that looks like. So let's check the exposure. But you can see here that on the bridge, I do have some blinkies, and that's a warning sign that I've got a blowout there. But looking at the histogram, it does not appear that I do. So when we get back to the studio, we'll be able to see that. But this is super helpful right here to show exactly what my exposure is. Another thing to note is that in the Sony cameras, you don't get the RGB histogram in live view. You have to look at the JPEG render to see those. So if you're worried about any of the individual colors being blown out, like if you have a lot of green, bright green, or a lot of red in your scene, a lot of yellow, that would show up here. If you have for instance, some of this yellow, if that was blown out, that would show up in the red and green channels. And so that would be your indication right there, looking at your RGB, and not necessarily the blended luminosity histogram. So you want to do that if you have a Sony camera, you want to check those too. Now, when I first started, I was so worried about blowing out my highlights that I would actually expose to the left, and that wound up giving me exposures that were super noisy in my shadows. And so I'd come back to the studio and my exposures would be way underexposed. My photos would be way underexposed. So when I processed them, I would try to bring up those details in the shadows, and they were super noisy. So I learned that the hard way, to expose to the right. And if we did that here, if we dial this back to -1 or -2, 2, it looks super dark on the LCD. And so I would know that, but just -1, it looks pretty good on the LCD, and I wouldn't know unless I looked at that histogram to see how far left it's pushed, and I've got nothing even close to being blown out in the highlights, but it looks right on the LCD screen. So when I took that exposure, it looked good to me, and I didn't know to look at the histogram. And I would come back to the studio, and it would look like this, which is way too dark. So again, looking at that histogram gives me the clue of how my exposure is. And now I'm super confident that I can get my exposure right when I'm out in the field. Just remember, you want to expose to the right. So you want your histogram to look more like this. You want to watch those spikes in the histogram. So right there, that would show that I'm a little bit blown out up here in the sky and the bridge. You want to bring that back a bit. And now that the sun's coming out a little bit, it's getting a little bit brighter out here, but you can see that that looks pretty good. And if you're worried about it, you can dial back just a little bit, but you're pushed pretty well to the right, and you're still exposing more than the camera thinks you should. The problem with modern cameras is that they're looking the entire scene and they're canvassing the scene to look for the exposure, and it doesn't know where an individual spot is blown out because it's averaging using that metering mode to average, and it may not see that you've got some pixels blown out, or it may not see that it's way underexposed just because you do have some super bright areas and super dark areas, and that contrast is problematic for cameras these days. So I would assume they're going to get better at that, but at this point the histogram is your best bet on making sure that you dial it in the way you want. And this is a technique that I learned from an outdoor landscape backpacking specialist. His name is Dave Morrow. You can check out his channel. He's got a lot of information about Aperture Priority and how to dial in your landscape scenes using Aperture Priority, and how he likes to gain focus and sharp focus from front to back. And he's got a lot of great information on there. I'll link his channel below. You can check him out. He was a really great resource for me when I first started. And I still watch his stuff and still learn. So you definitely want to go check him out. And as for dynamic range, I'm going to be doing a video soon all about dynamic range and how our eye perceives light and the difference between what we see and the camera sensor and what the camera sensor sees. And that's going to be a good video, so stay tuned for that. Okay, so like I said, if you're trying to make the move to manual and you haven't tried Aperture Priority, you may want to check out that video. I'll put a link in the description below. And don't forget to get your free Aperture Priority cheat sheet from that video so you can put it on your phone and have it with you for your next shoot. And I'll link that below as well. Okay, I hope this video helped. If you feel like it did, please hit that like button, as that really does help. And if you haven't already, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the little notification bell to stay in the loop around here. And I'll see you in the next video.